boxing has the deepest history of all organized sports. The early days were chronicled through writing, and we now witness combat spanning more than a century with our very own eyes. We have long pondered who would win in a matchup between the greats of the past. In today's episode, we take a look at a matchup between the first undisputed heavyweight champion in boxing, the Boston Strongboy John L. Sullivan, and former undisputed heavyweight champion, the Boilermaker James J. Jeffries. John L. Sullivan had a total of 41 official bouts under the Marquess of Queensberry rules, which is what all boxers compete under today. Sullivan had 38 wins, 32 by knockout, with a knockout ratio of 84%. He suffered only one defeat. He had one draw and one no decision. He stood at 5 feet 10 and a half inches with an aggregate weight of 208 pounds over his career. This included a 74-inch reach. James J. Jeffries had a total of 24 official fights. Jeffries had a total of 19 victories, with 16 coming by way of knockout for an 84% KO ratio. He suffered one defeat. Jeffries had a total of 2 draws and one no decision. He stood at 6 feet 1 and a half inches with an aggregate weight of 214 pounds over his career. This included a 74-inch reach. Sullivan was the first superstar in the sport of boxing and is credited with taking boxing mainstream. Sullivan is the last bare-knuckle champion, but he was truly a proponent for gloved fighting, the sport we know now. Sullivan was usually quick out of the gates and was the first to introduce the knockout as a regular occurrence in the sport at a mainstream level. Under the bare knuckles rules, fights could get drawn out and often featured a lot of holding and wrestling, not to mention eye gouging. Sullivan, for his time, represented the shift to knockouts in a similar capacity to what the Manasseh Mauler Jack Dempsey represented some 30 years after that in the Roaring Twenties. Sullivan often swarmed his opponents with a barrage of shots, which usually led to early knockouts or stoppages. He wasn't one for movers and what would now be considered more defensive fighters, and truly thrived off of fighters who chose to come forward and fight fire with fire. Sullivan would fight anywhere as he truly came of age in an era where a barge, basement, or good old-fashioned dirt could prove equally as satisfying as the standard boxing ring. He was most certainly hardened for a sport long riddled in controversy. James Jeffries was one of the large, more massive heavyweights for his time. Interestingly, for his size, he really was a very well-conditioned fighter, and oftentimes forced his opponents into deep waters in order to secure his knockouts and stoppages later in fights. In a way, Jeffries was the complete contrast to Sullivan, as the majority of his knockouts came later in fights as rounds went on, though he did have some early endings. Jeffries was often fundamentally deficient in comparison to his top opponents, but made up for that lack of pure, fundamental skill with his size and girth and endurance. He often used his weight and body to really wear down opponents. He thrived from being tied up and working from within the pocket. There is no question that Jeffries' style was translatable in any era of heavyweight boxing, and would prove to be a challenge for many in a weight class where things tend to end early regardless due to the size and power of the great heavyweights. Sullivan held titles from 1882 to 1892. Some of his more notable opponents are Charlie Mitchell, who he faced on more than one occasion, even under bare-knuckle and London prize-fighting rules. James J. Corbett, to whom he lost his world heavyweight title to in 1892, the only man to have defeated Sullivan. Paddy Ryan, his first signature win where he won the American Bare Knuckle Championship, and another fighter he faced on more than one occasion. Patsy Cardiff, for whom he drew with. Jake Kilrain, the fighter for which he officially won the Bare Knuckle Championship of the world. Dominic McCaffrey, a contender from his time, though some sources credit this fight as being the decider for the World Heavyweight Championship. Sullivan is also alleged to have participated in around 400 to 500 unofficial fights and exhibitions for which he won. Jeffries held the world heavyweight title from 1900 to 1904 when he retired from boxing. Notable opponents include Jack Johnson, which is undoubtedly Jeffries' most famous fight, where he came back from an 8-plus-year hiatus in an effort to face then undisputed and first black heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson, for the title in a losing effort. Jeffries holds 2 knockout wins over former heavyweight champion James Corbett, who was the first to dethrone John L. Sullivan. Jeffries holds 2 knockout wins over the UK great and former multi-division champion, Bob Fitzsimmons. He holds 2 victories over the rough and rugged heavyweight Tom Sharkey. Jeffries drew with the great Joe Koinski, who famously knocked out Jack Johnson, and a victory over Australian heavyweight great, Peter Jackson. Jeffries fought all comers, though he did draw the color line when he held the World Heavyweight Championship. Style and skill has to go to John L. Sullivan. He was far more formidable than the many opponents of his time whom he faced. Sullivan was able to essentially master his craft given the sheer number of fights he fought. Jeffries was never highly regarded in the skills department and was referred to as clumsy by the writers of his time. Endurance is even, but Sullivan fought in some of the longest bare-knuckle fights in history, which must be taken into account. Jeffries himself was known for his endurance and often fought 20 rounds or more, which is even more accentuated given his size. Both fighters had great chins and were only knocked out once in their career respectively, with each being years removed from their prime at the time of the stoppages. The slight edge in power goes to Jeffries, though this may be controversial to some. While Sullivan indeed racked up more knockout victories throughout his career in comparison to Jeffries, it must be noted that Jeffries holds knockout victories over some of the most formidable fighting machines in history, who had tons of fighting experience by comparison to many of Sullivan's opponents. Speed goes to Sullivan, undoubtedly, who often beat his opponents to the punch and was notably a fast starter. Resume goes to Jeffries with the slight edge, as he also faced the top black fighters of his era. Though some may not agree, Sullivan didn't face 2 notable black fighters from his time, Peter Jackson, whom Jeffries defeated, and the original George Godfrey, due to the color line he drew. That said, some may favor Sullivan's resume, taking into account his bare-knuckle work and unofficial fights. Intangibles go to Sullivan. Sullivan brought to the table all of those things you can't teach in boxing, and he was truly a mean SOB who was always ready for a fight. He was often in trouble for aggressive behavior in public, but truly did love a good scrap. All things considered, 86 Boxing favors the Boston Strongboy John L for the victory over the Boilermaker James J Jeffries via decision. Sullivan's offensive tenacity, bare-knuckle, and London prize-fighting ring experience, along with taking on a number of styles, including larger opponents who may have been comparable to Jeffries, would prove to be the difference over Jeffries, who will have met his match in the later rounds. Given Sullivan's experience going the distance in the bare-knuckle ranks, Jeffries wouldn't have that sweeping advantage over Sullivan. Additionally, Jeffries was outboxed on multiple occasions prior to securing stoppages over his opponents, who were at times much smaller. We're of the belief that Jeffries' style and lack of true fundamental skill would prove to be of benefit to Sullivan, who would have decent size and power, as well as the endurance to meet Jeffries head-on for a fight as long as it lasts.